What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller from Hook'emHeadlines.com coming back at y'all today with a little bit of a different approach to the video we're making here. I wanted to kind of dive into some details on a topic that came up in the last couple days here with Texas Athletic Director Chris del Conte kind of explaining the future fate of the Longhorn Network, and ultimately what will be the channel's fate upon Texas's move to the SEC in 2024. Now, a little bit of backstory. With Texas and OU moving to the SEC, it looked like the Longhorn Network was going to end up folding or, being moved into or merged into another network. Basically, either be merged or done away with in one way or another. I didn't think that the SEC was going to want to just take on the Longhorn Network in its current form. In 2022, CDC had announced that the Longhorn Network would be done away with, but the way that it would be done away with, I guess is the way to put it, changes now that Texas and OU are headed to the SEC 1 year earlier than originally anticipated. With Texas and OU leaving for the SEC in 2024 instead of 2025, that leaves 1 year left on the Longhorn Network's current media rights contract, or just the media rights contracts as a whole for the Big 12. And so, it adds kind of an extra layer to what happens with the Longhorn Network in the next couple of years. And from my understanding of the situation and from what CDC said in the last couple days here, I kind of want to explain some of the details of what will be going on. So, like I said, the Longhorn Network will still be done away with in some form or fashion. So, essentially, the way that this will happen at a high level is that the Longhorn Network will end up folding into the SEC network. Essentially, Texas will still have its events broadcast on the SEC network as any other team in the SEC will. The Longhorn Network will not be in its current form covering Texas sports. I will say that CDC mentioned over the weekend that there will still be some kind of influence from the Longhorn Network on Texas sports or on the SEC. I would imagine that has something to do with the inventory that he said Texas will still be sitting on upon the Longhorn Network folding into the SEC network. So it sounds like any of the inventory associated with the Longhorn Network and all that production in Austin will stay in Austin. And so I don't know whether that will be maybe like a side documentary series, another way that Texas can broadcast some of the smaller sports. Whatever that be, I would assume that that's what he's talking about with the influence. Maybe there's something I'm missing there. If there's anything that anyone else knows, definitely feel free to put it down in the comments. But my understanding of the situation and from what I've seen and who I've talked to about this situation in the past like 8 or 10 months, that seems to be the case in terms of what the Longhorn Network and what that sort of production could still mean in terms of like media broadcasting on the 40 acres. It's pretty obvious, but the Longhorn Network will be done away with ahead of the 2024 football season. I would assume in terms of like big events that the Longhorn Network broadcasts, the 2024 baseball season will be the last of the bunch. As it stands now, Longhorn Network gets quite a few it gets the majority of baseball games broadcast. Just because ESPN isn't going to end up picking up every single baseball game year in and year out for Texas. There are usually around, 8 or 10 at least basketball games and then 2 football games. So I would assume that a lot of those games will end up moving over to the SEC network because the SEC network broadcasts, it's usually about 2 or 3, depending on what point of the schedule it's at for football. If it's non-conference, at least 3. If it's conference schedule, you're usually around 2 football games per weekend. ESPN Plus will still house some of the smaller games, I would imagine, in football, especially in basketball. And then Like I said, those 8 or 10 games for men's hoops on Longhorn Network that you see every year, I would assume are going to be moved over to the SEC network as well. Baseball will probably be a similar story where you see most of the games moved from Longhorn Network to just the SEC network or ESPN Plus, because a lot of the games that aren't broadcast on Longhorn Network are on Big 12 Now or ESPN Plus as it currently stands. A few other key things of note here. For one, I think that the overwhelming reaction to this, even among Texas fans, is going to be pretty happy. I mean, Longhorn Network has not been an overwhelming success by any means. There were multiple reports that came out within the first 5 years of the Longhorn Network in operation that had it losing around $40 to $50 million for ESPN. And a lot of that had to do with some of the struggles in Texas athletics in the first half of the 2010s. While I don't think that the struggles were near as bad in the back half, you had more stability in terms of coaching. For all of the profit sports, you had more, at least up until this point. I mean, you still had Steve Sarkisian leaving for football, but I guess in the last couple of years, you have Steve Sarkisian leading the program to more success. There was points where Tom Herman had Texas, competing in the Big 12 and nationally. And then, the basketball team right now, and really just in the last couple of years, has, found a good bit of national success, won a tournament game last season, has spent a good bulk of this season ranked in the top 10 or the top 15. So from a profitability standpoint, I guess it has probably improved, but it doesn't really matter at this point. So like I said, from a profitability standpoint, it makes sense that it's going away, at least from what we know from the first half decade or so of its operations. And then I would say probably the other thing is just the the other reason why people will be happy about this going away is just the lack of accessibility. This is the most obvious point. This is really the last thing I'm going to talk about here. I've seen a few reports talking about how it cost for subscribers to pick it up just 29, or I guess this was for cable companies just to pick it up. It was 29 cents per subscriber to have the channel broadcast. So from that perspective, that doesn't sound all that expensive. And by my understanding, that really isn't. But the draw that you're going to get from the Longhorn Network compared to even another conference-wide network, say an SEC network, a Big Ten network, something like that, maybe even like the Pac-12 or the ACC network, you're just not getting that strong of a draw, especially with Texas athletics being down the way it has been in the last decade. And so, from that perspective, I get any streaming services or cable companies, their hesitancy to pick up the Longhorn Network in the first place. I will say this, as of this year, my understanding is the only streaming service that you can even get Longhorn Network on is one Sling TV package. I believe it's Sling TV Orange, and I think it's like $50 a month. It's a weird assortment of channels, and again, that is the only way for a streaming only service that you can get the Longhorn Network. There are so many streaming services out there, and the fact that that's the only one it should tell you how how unwilling a lot of companies are to pick up that channel. Cable companies, it's a little bit more accessible, but still kind of hard to find. And it's not just like a channel that you could, like a lot of the other kind of services that you get attached to watch ESPN or ESPN Plus, whether that be something like a Big 12 Now, ACC Network Extra, some things like that are a little bit more accessible. Longhorn Network, you have to have these really specialized streaming or cable subscriptions to be able to watch it on the app, or on the ESPN app. And so, like I said, no matter what, it was, from an accessibility standpoint, it was always really difficult. And there's some important games every single year in major sports for Texas that end up on Longhorn Network. This year for basketball, even great example, tomorrow night's game against Iowa State. It's a top 25 game with postseason implications. Texas is fighting for a number one seed, both in the Big 12 tournament. They're fighting for a Big 12 regular season crown as well. but also in the NCAA tournament. And so it's something that we see year after year where Texas has an important game, maybe an important conference game, maybe one that wasn't expected to be big. I think of a few years ago when Texas hosted Iowa State at home. I believe that was during the 2018 season. It was a top 25 game. Texas was fighting to get into a spot in the Big 12 championship game, and the game was on Longhorn Network. It ended up being like a 24-10 win, something like that for Texas. And again, most people, by my understanding at least, that read the site weren't able to watch it. So that was a good example of just a game with pretty massive implications that all Texas fans care about, and that unless you want to be paying, like I said, like $50 a month to just get that channel, then it was something that just, back to this major point, it wasn't very accessible. So I think I kind of summed this up well in terms of like what it will mean for the Longhorn Network to end up folding into the SEC network here in 2024, in the summer of 2024, and then, like I said, just from profitability and accessibility standpoint, why I would imagine that the wide opinion here is that it's a good thing that the Longhorn Network is going away. I ultimately think this was a failed experiment. So anyway, for Andrew Miller at Hook'emHeadlines.com, that's pretty much it. Welcome.